On May 17, 2001, a daughter was born to the couple Fabiano Alcaino and Carolina Donoso Campos. She was named Gabriela. She received a double surname from her parents, Alcaino Donoso. The family lived in the city of Santiago de Chile. From childhood, the girl was surrounded by care, especially her paternal grandfather, Carlos, and uncle, aka godfather, Rodrigo Alcaino, loved her. Gabriela was surrounded with love by her parents, only they themselves failed to maintain the marriage union. Their divorce took place when the daughter was 5 years old. The father soon married a new favorite, Catalina Bis, who had 2 children from her previous husband. Despite this, Fabiano never forgot about his own daughter, helped her and the former spouse. Gabriela got along well with her half-brother and sister and cousins, and in general, her childhood was spent in happiness, love, and understanding. The girl turned 15. A difficult teenage period lasted. At one school party, she met Fabian Casares Aravena, who was older than her by a year. He charmed her not only with his looks, but also with his prudence, restraint, mystery, and gallantry. His parents were respected people in society and strove to give their son the best education. When dialoguing with someone, Fabian never looked at the interlocutor in the eyes. Perhaps so manifested shyness or concealment of a hidden nature. Gabriela formed a warm relationship with him at first, but after about 1.5 months, he began to change for the worse. He made her ignore her friends and controlled almost every step she took. Gabriela's uncle insisted on meeting Fabian, but their meeting never happened. But the girl's father met him and asked him to take care of his daughter and protect her. The guy promised to arrange her best romantic reality. Of course, the beau deceived the father of his passport and gradually showed tyranny to her. It started with inappropriate jealousy and then the abuse. Gabriela withdrew into herself, distanced herself from her friends, and practically did not smile. At one point, she was fed up with Fabian's antics and announced that she was leaving him. However, after a short pause, for some unknown reason, she returned to him. A year after their acquaintance, the guy at a school disco showed physical aggression towards 2 classmates. One beat, the second tried to rape. But the incident was quickly hushed up, and the case did not come to the police. But the culprit was promptly expelled from school. Further studies were homeschooled. Without this, guy would not have been admitted to the final exams. This event further deterred Gabriela from the young tyrant. She considered him mentally unhealthy. He did not want to put up with this situation and pursued her, demanded to communicate, and even waited for her at home. For some time, the stalker fell behind. The girl was preparing for exams. In addition, her father had a grief. A neighbor killed his second wife, Gabriela's stepmother. The daughter and the first wife did not leave the man without support. A couple months later, the harassment continued and manifested itself in increasingly severe ways, such as harassment outside the store, public scenes of jealousy, offensive writings on the walls of her house, regular ambushes near her school and residence. Gabriela shared her experiences with her friends. In several voicemails, admitted that Caceres was crossing the boundaries of adequacy and she would no longer allow herself to be treated harshly. Realizing that the worst can be expected from the aggressor, the girl took safety measures. So never again went alone, even to the nearest store, only in the company of friends or relatives. But still, she was afraid that this psycho would catch up with her anywhere. In 2018, the girl had already turned 17, and she was finishing her graduation class. Next, she wanted to enter the faculty of journalism or business and advertising, perhaps to take preparatory courses at a university from a neighboring region. On June 10th, her father took her to the entrance exam to the institute and picked her up afterwards. On the way, they discussed the subtleties of education and getting a profession. A little later in the evening, the whole family gathered to celebrate the birthday of Carlos' grandfather, who turned 81. Everyone was having fun, but Gabriela sank into thought, although outwardly tried to smile and even played with her cousins. Uncle Rodrigo asked his niece how she was doing, and in response, he received a phrase about worry. The man thought that it was tension against the background of exams and enrollment in university, and did not press her. After the celebration, everyone left. There was no sign of trouble. But in the early morning of June 11th, Cáceres, filled with furious anger, went to Gabriella's house and took a knife with him. At 4 a.m., he was already there, easily climbing over the low fence and at the door. Gabriella's mother heard a rustle and opened the wicket leading to the garden, and immediately ran into Fabian, who attacked her with a knife with rage, causing 31 wounds in total. After killing the woman, he went into the house. The girl heard her mother screaming and called the police. Panicked, she could not explain to the operator what was going on. It became quiet. She went down the stairs, and Fabian attacked her, smashed her phone, hit her on the head with the handle of a knife. The girl lost consciousness, and he raped her, and then killed her with the same weapon. He placed the bodies of the mother and daughter in the kitchen. He left shoe marks in the pool of blood, and when he noticed this, he tried to cover them up. Then he tried to wash his clothes in the bathroom. He then went downstairs and quietly left the scene of the crime, forgetting one detail. There were traces of his shoes stained with blood in the bathroom. The next day, he woke up as if nothing had happened, smiling and joking, in a great mood. Even posted a video of himself playing guitar on social networking sites. Only on June 12th, a certain Marcel called Rodrigo introduced himself as a colleague of his sister, Carolina, explained that there for 2 days has not appeared at work and does not contact. He called Fabiano, Gabriella's father. It turned out that he too was not aware of what was going on. Calls to the rest of the family followed. Neither Gabriella nor Carolina had been in contact with any of them for 2 days, and the girl did not show up at the institute to find out the results of the exams. It all seemed very strange, and Fabiano excused himself from work to visit his ex-wife. He ran through different versions, from illness to a domestic blackout, but he couldn't imagine what had really happened. Caroline's car was parked outside the house, which immediately caused alarm. Fabiano had the keys to the main door and the garden door, but he hesitated to go inside for a long time, called his brother and described the situation, admitting that he was very nervous and did not know what to do. At this moment, a neighbor came up to him and informed him that she had recently heard terrible screams from that house. She interpreted them as a regular quarrel between mother and daughter. It soon became quiet, and there was a sense of reconciliation. Fabiano's nerves began to give out, and he called the police. Half an hour later, the police arrived. Due to shaking hands, the man could not open the doors. At this point, Rodrigo called, who also became alarmed and asked to leave the phone on speaker. At approximately 10:50 a.m., officers entered the home and found 2 bloody bodies in the kitchen. The officers contacted their colleagues and asked them to send in experts. Fabiano soon saw the horrifying scene as well. His cries of despair were also heard by Rodrigo. Both could not believe what had happened, hoping that the medics would arrive and save Gabriella and Carolina. But police officers said the bodies had been lying there for probably more than a day, a death, and expressed condolences to the man. 15 minutes later, experts and detectives arrived. Curious gawkers also gathered, and a little later Rodrigo arrived. In his uncle's head, like a siren, his niece's phrase, "I'm worried." Now he interpreted those words with a new meaning. Among the crowd of curious citizens and police, he saw that the officers were questioning his brother. Those decided to immediately work off the initial theory that Fabiano was the perpetrator. They placed him in the back seat of a squad car and locked him in. He initially thought it was a standard formality, but when he tried to get out, he realized that he was locked out and was now considered the prime suspect. Fabiano desperately pounded on the glass, begging to be let out. One of the officers came up to him and asked him why he was yelling. The reason for his shouting turned out to be simple panic and a strong desire to go to the toilet. The policeman told him to be quiet and not to make noise. The citizen was blocked within the framework of the necessary official actions. Fabiano was hysterical and his bladder was overflowing. He assured the officer that he would never do such a thing to his daughter and ex-wife. After about 5 minutes, an officer with a higher rank came up, inquired about what was going on, and the story about the toilet was told again. In response to pleas to be released from the car, questioning continued. The officers were confused by the man's heightened state of nervousness and the fact that he refused to enter the house with the right keys. In response, They received an explanation of intense anxiety and fear. Eventually, they took pity on the poor man, but let him go to the toilet, accompanied by a sergeant. He returned and the interrogation resumed. He was treated as if he had actually committed the brutal murders. It was an extremely convenient theory for the police. They were not embarrassed that Fabiano had called the squad himself, and his nervousness was explained by his shock. Detectives, after examining the house, immediately ruled out the possibility of theft. All valuables, money, and equipment were not missing. The perpetrator pursued only one goal: to brutally kill Gabriella and her mother. The experts concluded that the girl had been sexually abused. Rodrigo was embarrassed that the police took too long to question his brother as the real killer. He intervened in the conversation with a question about finding out the address of Gabriella's former suitor. Her father didn't have that information. But suddenly a guy came out of the crowd and called Rodrigo over to talk privately. It turned out to be one of his niece's friends, and he described what the relationship between the murdered girl and Fabian Caceres was like. It turned out that a few days before the tragedy, the guy was harassing Gabriella again. She yelled at him to back off. Between them for a long time, everything is, of course. The answer sounded terrifying. Either you will be mine, or no one will get you. Such words could be regarded as a threat, and the police, having recorded the testimony of the dead girl's friend, went to Caceres' house. But he wasn't there. The picture looked rather strange. Meanwhile, experts who scrutinized the crime scene found evidence that the father did not kill his daughter and ex-wife. They reported this to the team stationed outside Caceres' home at the time, along with Fabiano Alcaino. The officers apologized to the man, explained that they were just doing their job, and let him go home. The next day, an official investigation into the double murder began. All friends of the dead girl were interviewed. Two of her friends provided investigators with voice messages from Gabriella complaining about Caceres' abusive treatment of her. After comparing the recordings with other testimonies, the task force made the guy the #1 suspect. After a detailed examination of the house of the deceased, their bodies were taken for forensic examination. Rodrigo and Fabiano were invited for identification, as well as Carolina's father, Ricardo, and a neighbor, Hector. Through a special glass, all confirmed the identities of the victims, and on June 15th, the funeral took place. In addition to relatives and friends, all sympathetic citizens came. The coffin with Gabriella's mother was closed and was not allowed to look at the body because the victim had multiple wounds on her face, which because of this, became unrecognizable. The procession continued even after the closing of St. Joseph Benito Cotolengo Church. Hundreds of people came there to say goodbye to the victims. Fabiano was so immersed in grief that he did not notice how the church emptied and the procession to the cemetery Melipilo began. However, the unhappy father soon caught up with the mass. The police closed the street for the procession to pass, and the procession traveled without obstruction to Melipilo. Before the burial, Fabiano made a speech. He had originally prepared a long one beforehand, but because of the excess of emotion went solid improvisation. He sincerely thanked all the gathered people and the sympathy shown, and admitted that he could not realize what had happened. On the day of the funeral of Caroline and Gabriella, a few hours later, the police found Fabian's whereabouts and detained him. He immediately denied his guilt, but quickly cracked and confessed to the brutal murder. The next morning, the local newspapers were full of headlines with photos of the killer, and the TV news also talked about it. The personality of Fabian Caceres was abhorred and hated by the entire country. The commissioner of the National Department of Investigation confirmed this information to the press and added that key physical evidence was found at the murder scene: the perpetrator's DNA, components of his clothing, shoe impressions. The evidence found was undeniable and pointed specifically to Gabriella's ex-boyfriend. And at first, he behaved defiantly and arrogantly in the investigator's office, refused to describe in detail the day of the murder. So the police contacted his parents and used them to influence the detainee, and the detainee told the story of the murder with all the details. Investigators also got a search warrant for the killer's home, and officers found the following evidence. One pair of DC slippers. They were washed, but not yet completely dry. Forensics later confirmed blood residue from both victims. A knife with a damaged end. It's consistent with the mutilations inflicted on the murdered women. The guy's clothes, washed, but with faint blood stains. Analysis also proved they belonged to the victims. With all the evidence and testimony collected, a formal charge was filed for the following counts. Sexual abuse of an underage girl. Murder of Carolina Donoso Campos with particular cruelty. Double murder. The guy was 18 years old, and the prospect of severe punishment loomed before him. The prosecutor did her best to make the sentence as adequate as possible to the crime committed. At the first trial, the prosecutor Jose Solis, provided the judge with audio recordings of voice messages that had been given to him by Gabriella's girlfriends. According to them, the killers presented a cruel, cynical, and inadequate person, or rather a beast. The family of the victims asked the investigation to qualify the crime as a particularly brutal murder of a woman. In response, the prosecutor's office referred to the then-current law in 2018 that the act committed did not fall into this classification. The crime is in this category if the perpetrator was a spouse or cohabitant. And in fact, Fabian came to the victims as a nobody, despite the fact that he had been dating Gabriella for some time. Then the prosecution made a different maneuver. The perpetrator went to the bench under a different article, murder with aggravating factors. But at that time, the penalty was only 15 years in prison. Trembled and the lawyer of the defendant, presenting the client in a favorable light that he had never previously committed any crime. While at the will of the court, Fabian went to a temporary detention in an investigative isolator, and his defense and prosecutors were given 6 months to form arguments and present them in court at the next session. The defense lawyer broke off, insisting that his client be housed at home for this period. The judge refused this request. Friends, acquaintances, and relatives of Carolyn and Gabriella were annoyed by the court's interpretation because the case was not treated as a murder of a woman. It was obvious that Fabian did not put up with Gabriella's departure and spoiled her life with his harassment. He had also attacked her mother, knowing that she could not defend herself there. Gabriella's father became disillusioned with the justice system, which was not working in the best interest of Carolina and Gabriella. Plus, he was infuriated by the prosecutor who said the girl had not fought back in the last moments of her life. It felt like the authorities were shifting the blame to the victim. From that moment on, Fabiano was filled with a desire to change the law. His ally in this mission became Rodrigo. Their goal is the emergence of Gabriella's law. Its essence is the expansion of the definition of femicide. The person who violates it would be prosecuted to the fullest extent without depending on who he came from, the victim or the murdered. However, Chile already had a similar law in place since 2010, condemning perpetrators to harsh penalties and providing support measures for victims and their families. But it contained a lot of flaws and needed adjustments. But the fighters for Gabriella's law took it as a baseline. Fabiano and Rodrigo quickly gained the support of friends and relatives of the victims. Then national lawyers for gender equality and women's affairs got involved. Many rallies were held in favor of the new laws, and they were even televised. First, they covered the city where the victims lived, then their region and the whole country. On June 30th, 2018, the then Minister for Women and Their Equality, Isabel Pla, studied the requests of the activists, agreed with the logic of their actions, and promised to explore all possibilities to form a Gabriella law. According to the idea, this initiative would consider different types of romantic relationships when proving feminicide, even if the perpetrator and the victim did not live in the same house or apartment. The law passed would have increased the penalties for defendants, and perpetrators would receive a minimum of 40 years in prison without parole. This prospect encouraged almost all feminist organizations in the country. Soledad Rojas was the leader of one of the movements and was also a member of the Coordinating Commission of the System Against Violence Against Women. She recognized the error of the then legislators and their interpretations. It is absurd to consider the murder of a woman in terms of whether or not she has intimate relations. Abusing and humiliating women, much less murdering them, are serious crimes that require severe punishment. As for the relationship between Gabriella and Fabian, it had all the hallmarks of feminicide, and the investigation should have been based on that fact, and the subsequent murder was committed by the perpetrator because of the gender status of the victim. In the situation of the inhumane massacre of Caroline, there was a huge public outcry, and it was urgent to expand the term feminicide and the corresponding articles. A year passed after the brutal murder. It was only then that the government considered the urgency of implementing the bill. The first instance where the necessary work took place was the Senate for Women's Affairs and Gender Equality. And in August 2019, the Gabriella Law was approved there. In society, the news was greeted with enthusiasm. However, there was still a final vote to be taken. The father was well aware that the cherished reforms will not return his daughter, but other women will receive the necessary legal assistance from the state. There were 14 adjustments to the penal code in the outline draft, and all of them came from the executive branch. The following extensions were made to the law. The concept of femicide included any humiliation of a woman, harsh treatment of her, murder on the basis of hatred on the basis of sex. The type of relationship to the murderer is irrelevant. A variety of aggravating factors are taken into account: insults, moral and physical violence, disability, or the minor age of the victim. The project's implementation was being studied by Congress. While the discussions were going on, Gabriella's relatives went to educational institutions and advised young girls on the rules of behavior and consequences of violent acts in relationships. Discontent in the country was growing. Citizens resented the protracted period of work on the law. There were protests in almost every city. And on January 30th, 2020, Congress went to work on the last day before the February recess. Voting began at 11 a.m. to pass Gabriella's law. At 1 p.m., the procedure ended, and the monitor reflected the results. 100% of the votes in favor. The law was finally passed at the official state level. On March 2nd of that year, it was signed into law by then-President Sebastián Piñera. It was a landmark reform in Chile's criminal history, the long-awaited law in action. And now Fabiano, Rodrigo, and other loved ones of the dead women were clamoring for maximum punishment for the killer. At the time, the case against this punisher was led by prosecutor Paula Zarate, and she was preparing the material for a new trial, already taking into account the reforms in the law. On April 21st, 2022, the court announced the final verdict. Fabian Cáceres Aravena is sent to life imprisonment in a maximum security prison for the murders of his ex-girlfriend and her mother. The charge of sexually abusing Gabriella was excluded from the case file because it could not be proven officially. But to the family of the murdered girl, he was still considered a rapist. Their anger was soon echoed by many concerned citizens, and the streets were filled with pickets demanding justice. After the final court hearing, the murderer was adequately punished. On the way out of the courtroom, media representatives interviewed Gabriella's father. Gabriella's father confessed the following to the journalists: feeling relieved after the tedious wait, satisfied with the guilty verdict, because Cáceres is a real maniac, and he destroyed his family, destroyed the lives of all who knew and loved Gabriella and Carolina. In 2022, the loss of 4 years ago is perceived a little calmer, but still the investigation, dragged out for 4 years, is exhausting. There are serious psychological traumas, even depression, because before the death of Caroline and Gabriella, the man had a second wife, Died, and also violent death. He lost 3 of his favorite women. Rodrigo was the next to leave the courtroom. He was also stopped by journalists for an interview. He was not so verbose and voiced his feelings. It's still hard to come to terms with such a loss. The sentence is logical. Let the perpetrator suffer in confinement for the rest of his life. The last time he spoke to his niece, He should have questioned her experiences in more detail. Perhaps it would have saved her and her mother's life. In this story, Gabriella's family has shown itself to be true fighters in the fight for justice. She quickly found allies among community organizations and brought the process to the highest levels, making history in Chile. After all, thanks to her activism, has done much more for the women of the country than many previous legislators. True, to do so, she had to overcome the terrible pain of loss.